Humanity is an evolutionary accident, unsuited for the ocean, incapable of adapting, and utterly irrelevant in aquatic environments. Your kind is a joke beneath the waves. The words cut through the grand lecture hall like a knife, each syllable laced with derision. Professor Zelther, a towering figure of academia, stood at the podium, his luminescent, amphibious skin shifting in hues of deep blues and greens. His audience, a diverse assembly of alien scholars, students, and researchers from across the galaxy, chuckled in agreement, their various tentacles, mandibles, and translucent eyelids twitching with amusement. Seated near the back, Dr. Evan Carter, the only human present, clenched his jaw. He had expected skepticism from alien academia, but outright mockery? That was new. Zelther continued, his webbed fingers splayed dramatically. Your species cannot breathe underwater, withstand crushing depths, or navigate the oceanic abyss without cumbersome technology. Compared to the Hydraxians of Orus IV or the Kelphids of Inox, your kind is hopelessly primitive in the water. If the tides dictated dominance, humans would have never left their shores. More laughter. Someone near Evan muttered, "Drywalkers think they belong everywhere." This time, they're out of their depth, literally. Evan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. He wasn't just a scientist. He was an engineer, a problem solver. And more than that, he was stubborn. When the laughter died down, Evan stood. The movement was small, but in a hall where no one expected a human to challenge an expert, it commanded attention. Conversations halted. A few alien scholars turned to observe the lone Terran who had dared to rise. "Professor," Evan said, his voice carrying across the room. "Your assessment is thorough, if we're discussing the past. But science is about pushing boundaries, isn't it?" He took a step forward. "Give me 1 year, and I'll prove you wrong." The silence that followed was absolute. Then, a sudden ripple of amusement passed through the crowd, a low murmur of disbelief and curiosity. Zelther's expression morphed into something resembling pity. 1 year? The professor tilted his head. "And what, exactly, do you propose?" Evan squared his shoulders. "I will create a technology that allows humans to survive and operate underwater with complete autonomy, without bulky submarines, without external support. Not just survive, but thrive." A collective intake of breath swept the hall. No species in the galaxy had ever attempted such a feat without biological advantages. Zelther's gills flared. Ambitious. But ambition alone does not rewrite physics. Evan smirked. Neither does complacency. That struck a nerve. The professor's eyes darkened. "Very well, human. You have your challenge." He turned to the gathered scholars. "Let it be recorded, Dr. Evan Carter claims he can achieve what no land dweller has done before. 1 year from today, he will present his so-called solution to the Galactic Scientific Assembly." Evan's pulse hammered in his ears, but he held his ground. Zelther leaned forward, voice dripping with mockery. "And when you fail, let this serve as a permanent lesson: humans do not belong beneath the waves." More laughter. More doubt. But Evan didn't care. Because in his mind, he had already started building. The challenge was set, and there was no turning back. Evan Carter left the lecture hall with measured steps, his mind racing through equations, materials, and the sheer impossibility of what he had just promised. He knew exactly how the academic world worked, especially among alien scholars. If he failed, humanity wouldn't just lose credibility in the field of oceanic research. They would become a universal punchline, another footnote in the long list of overambitious species who overestimated their own brilliance. But failure wasn't an option. The first obstacle wasn't the science, it was the funding. Back on Luna Research Station, Evan's personal lab was well equipped for engineering extreme environment prototypes, but developing a self-sustaining air bubble generator capable of adapting to shifting ocean pressures? That would require materials, testing facilities, and time. More than that, it would require trust. Trust was hard to come by when everyone thought you were chasing a fantasy. "You promised what?" Dr. Elena Voss, an exobiologist and longtime friend, stared at him through the hollow screen, her expression a mixture of disbelief and barely restrained laughter. I step away for a few months, and you go and challenge one of the top aquatic scholars in the galaxy? Evan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. It's not as crazy as it sounds. She snorted. It sounds exactly as crazy as it sounds. Elena, listen. We've already made massive strides in adaptive oxygen tech. Deep-sea suits, pressure-resistant materials, liquid-breathing solutions. None of which are designed for sustained, independent human survival underwater. She folded her arms. I assume you have an actual plan? I do. A long pause. All right, she finally said. Let's hear it. Evan tapped a command on his console, sending over schematics. The core idea is simple. If we can't evolve for the ocean, we bring the environment with us. I want to create a field-based atmospheric stabilization system, a way to generate and maintain breathable air in place, not just through tanks or enclosed structures. Elena's eyebrows lifted as she skimmed through the data. A self-generating air bubble? Exactly. Something that maintains breathable oxygen levels while dynamically adjusting for depth, pressure, and movement. Think of it as an artificial atmosphere, but one we can carry. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she scrolled through the files, occasionally making small gestures as she ran calculations in her head. When she finally spoke, her tone had shifted. You'd need a nanopermeable barrier to prevent oxygen diffusion, she muttered, almost to herself. An active regulation system to counter hydrostatic pressure. Energy efficiency would be the biggest hurdle. If your system requires constant external power, it'll never work in deep-sea environments. Evan allowed himself a small smile. This was why he needed her. Elena didn't waste time telling him something was impossible. She was already figuring out how to make it work. That's where adaptive biomimicry comes in, he said. Some of the best oceanic species have evolved specialized gill-like membranes that regulate gas exchange even under extreme pressures. If we can engineer a system that uses similar principles, we can create a sustainable cycle. She exhaled, shaking her head in reluctant admiration. You really don't do things halfway, do you? Not when the entire galaxy is laughing at us. Elena's expression hardened. Then let's make them choke on that laughter. 2 weeks later, the lab was buzzing with activity. Evan had assembled a team, engineers, biologists, computational theorists, all willing to take the risk, to push the limits of human innovation. They had secured initial funding from Earth's Deep Space Initiative, and more importantly, they had something no alien scientist accounted for, relentless human stubbornness. But not everyone wanted them to succeed. Late one night, as Evan worked through oxygen retention models, a silent alert flashed across his console. Unauthorized access attempt. Someone was trying to breach their research servers. He frowned, pulling up security logs. The attempt was professional, no amateur hacker. Someone was watching. And someone wanted them to fail. The breach attempt had been clean, surgical. Whoever had tried to access Evan's research wasn't some amateur data thief. They were precise, methodical, and, most concerning of all, patient. They hadn't gone for obvious files or attempted brute force entry. Instead, they had probed system vulnerabilities, searching for weaknesses. Testing the defenses. Evan wasted no time locking down access to his team's work, doubling encryption layers, and rerouting their research into an isolated quantum-secure server. One that wasn't even connected to the broader station network. But the incident gnawed at him. Someone, somewhere, had decided that his project was a threat. The question was, why? Could be Zelther's people, Elena said when he brought it up the next morning. She sipped her coffee, staring at the lines of security code Evan had pulled up. They'd love to catch us violating some obscure interstellar patent so they can shut us down before we even start. Evan shook his head. No, this wasn't academic espionage. This was more subtle. Whoever did this wasn't just looking to steal ideas, they were looking to sabotage something. Elena set her mug down. So now we're not just fighting physics. We're fighting someone who doesn't want us to succeed. He nodded. Which means we must be on the right track. The next few weeks were a relentless grind. The first prototype, nicknamed Project Aegis, was a disaster. The nanopermeable membrane designed to maintain the air bubble failed under sustained pressure, the gas exchange regulator froze at extreme depths, and a pressure feedback loop nearly imploded one of their test chambers. But failure didn't discourage them. Iteration was everything. They reworked the gas exchange model, borrowing principles from deep-sea thermophiles that could withstand extreme environments. The membrane structure was reinforced with graphene composite latticework, making it flexible but resistant to pressure shifts. They tested automated buoyancy control, ensuring the air bubble remained stable in turbulent waters. Breakthroughs came in fragments, small victories buried under long nights. Then, on test trial number 37, they saw it. Evan and Elena stood at the observation deck as the submersible drone descended into the pressure-controlled tank. The air bubble generator, now the size of a backpack, activated with a low hum. A pulse rippled through the water. For the first time, the air didn't collapse. It didn't distort. It held. Inside the shimmering field, oxygen levels stabilized. The drone's atmospheric sensors confirmed it, an isolated, self-sustaining human-breathable pocket of air in the middle of the water. No external tank. No rigid dome. Just open, breathable space where there should have been none. Elena let out a slow breath. We just changed the game. Evan exhaled, tension finally releasing from his chest. Now we prove it works outside a tank. 2 days later, they took Project Aegis to Poseidon 9, a deep-sea research outpost on an alien ocean moon. The waters were hostile, filled with crushing depths and currents no human had ever entered unprotected. This wasn't a simulation. This was real. The team prepped. Pressure suits were equipped, not for oxygen, but as a contingency in case the generator failed. Their mission was simple: deploy Project Aegis at 300 meters depth. If the system could hold stable there, it could hold anywhere. Evan secured the device to his suit and stepped onto the diving platform. The ocean stretched below, an endless abyss of blue-black void. This was it. A final check. A deep breath. Then, with nothing but a thin field of technology between him and the crushing deep, Evan jumped. The deep-sea dive had begun. Evan felt the weight of the ocean press down on him almost immediately as he descended. At 100 meters, the pressure was already more than 3 times what humans experienced at sea level. By 200 meters, his suit began to hum with the tension of the environment, the air bubble generator's low pulse serving as a reminder that all the success of their research meant nothing unless this fragile pocket of breathable air could withstand the unforgiving depths. The dive itself was supposed to be straightforward: descend, deploy, test. Simple. Efficient. Safe. But Evan knew better. No one had ever made it this far without a heavily reinforced submersible. No one had ever attempted sustained human survival at this depth without massive, rigid containment. The suit felt almost comically fragile against the vastness of the ocean around him. His heartbeat quickened as the pressure continued to mount. Pressure at 250 meters. Stable. Generator core is active. The voice of his support team crackled in his earpiece. Pressure at 300 meters. Bubble integrity holding. The lead engineer confirmed, her voice steady despite the growing tension. Evan gave a slight nod, though no one could see it. Every muscle in his body was taut. The air bubble generator on his back hummed louder now as it worked overtime to create and sustain the breathable atmosphere. He could feel the slight pull of the surrounding water, and in that moment, the weight of the oceans felt as if it were bearing down directly on his chest. Then, the first attack came. A massive shape swirled in the dark abyss below, undulating slowly, its enormous bulb barely visible in the green-black depths. It was massive, a deep-sea creature of unimaginable size, its body adorned with bioluminescent tendrils that drifted like ethereal ghostly flames. Evan froze. The air bubble generator hummed loudly in his suit as he adjusted his grip on the stabilizer tether, trying to stabilize his movements in the face of the growing storm. The creature surged upward with terrifying speed, slamming into the bubble's perimeter with a deafening thud. Evan's suit vibrated, a deep groan in the metal joints of his suit as it was jolted by the force. "Evan, what the hell was that?" Alina's voice cut through his earpiece, frantic. Evan struggled to steady his breath as he tried to regain control of the situation. His hands were shaking, but he could feel the generator at his back continuing to pulse with steady power. He tried to get his bearings, but the creature's glowing form loomed ever closer, its size more imposing with each passing moment. The bubble was holding. It was holding. But the real question was, could it survive a direct impact from something of that scale? He switched his HUD to readjust parameters, checking real-time data. Depth, pressure, oxygen levels, all the critical readings remained within acceptable margins. But that did nothing to calm the rising anxiety gnawing at him. The ocean felt like it was closing in around him. Then, a second strike, this time, from a different direction. Something massive and heavy slammed into the other side of the bubble. Terror. That was the only way Evan could describe the sensation that gripped him in that moment. This wasn't just an experiment anymore. It was a fight for survival. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat thunderous in his ears as his vision blurred momentarily. "Evan, report." He forced his breathing to slow, forcing himself to focus. There were no obvious cracks in the air bubble's surface, but something felt wrong, too much pressure, too much force pressing in from all sides. The creatures were toying with him, testing the limits of his technology, of his humanity. He was an interloper, and in their domain, even the slightest failure would mean his death. But just as quickly as the assault began, the creatures retreated, vanishing back into the black. The waters were eerily still, and for a moment, Evan wasn't sure if he had just imagined the entire thing. His team's voices crackled in his earpiece. Bubble integrity holding steady. Depth still stable at 300 meters. Oxygen levels optimal. The warning light in Evan's suit began to flash, indicating an unexpected disturbance in the water's chemical composition. The sudden shift caused him to pause, confused. He checked the readings again. There was a massive dissolution of oxygen content around him. Something was contaminating the bubble's atmospheric environment. The air inside his suit began to thin, and he realized in an instant that the generator had been compromised. "I need a way out, now," he hissed into his comms. "This isn't just a test anymore." His heart raced as he fought against the claustrophobic pressure building around him. The deep had taken its first shot. And Evan Carter had no idea what was coming next. The air was thinning, growing faint in Evan's lungs as the disturbance in the air bubble's oxygen content began to escalate. Every breath felt heavier, as if the ocean itself was pressing in against him, trying to squeeze the life out of his body. His suit's HUD flashed with alarming data, oxygen depletion at 37%. Pressure feedback error, 18% deviation from expected parameters. His hands were slick with sweat as he manipulated the control interface, struggling to maintain any semblance of composure. His heart raced, the beat a pounding drum in his ears as the seconds stretched, each one laden with the possibility of disaster. The creatures from earlier hadn't attacked again, but their sudden presence was a stark reminder of how fragile human life was in the depths of this alien ocean. "Evan, what's going on down there?" Alina's voice crackled in his ear. It was calm, but the underlying tension was clear. She could feel it too, the pressure mounting, the clock ticking down. "I've got a contamination in the bubble. Oxygen levels are dropping. I need a way to stabilize it, now." Evan's voice was tight, barely above a whisper. He could feel the air around him thinning further, the edges of his vision starting to blur. "We're running diagnostics up here. Just hold on, Evan. We're working as fast as we can." The calm in Alina's voice didn't ease the panic tightening its grip on Evan's chest. Working as fast as they can wasn't good enough. The ocean didn't wait. If the bubble failed, it would collapse in on itself, flooding his suit with water, and he would be trapped in the crushing depths. He needed to act now. His mind raced through possible solutions. They had accounted for pressure issues. They had tested for basic integrity failure. But biochemical interference, this wasn't something they had prepared for. Evan's thoughts went to the creatures, the ones that had tested the bubble earlier. Could their biology be releasing something? Some compound that reacted with the technology? The thought was chilling. He glanced at the holographic display of his air bubble. It shimmered in the water, a barely perceptible ripple around its surface. Oxygen was depleting too quickly. He had minutes, maybe less. In the silence of the deep, he had no choice but to act quickly. His fingers danced over the suit's interface, cycling through the emergency protocols. Overdrive mode, designed for situations where the system could push beyond its limits, came up on the screen. But he hesitated. The danger was real. If he activated it without understanding the cause of the failure, the system could burn out, and the consequences would be catastrophic. A warning flashed across his visor. Overdrive engaged, risk of system overload. Evan slammed his hand down on the button. There was no time left to think. He had no choice but to push the bubble's regenerative capabilities to their limits. He felt the hum of the generator intensify, the air pressure in his suit increasing as the system kicked into high gear. Oxygen was being synthesized, but not enough. Not nearly enough. Evan's breath caught in his throat as the pressure within the bubble began to build, forcing the molecules together, compressing, stabilizing. But the creatures were back. This time, they weren't just circling, they were closing in. Evan's sensors picked up a disturbance in the water, large movements just outside his field of view. He could hear the grinding of something massive scraping against the bubble. His stomach turned, the instinct to flee almost overwhelming. But there was no escape. Not now. Evan. You need to get out of there. Alina's voice was frantic. You are pushing the system too hard. If you don't. I know. Evan shouted, his voice shaking with the raw edge of panic. His fingers flew over the controls, manually adjusting the air bubble's structural supports. The system was barely holding together, but he had no choice. The pressure outside, the creatures, the oxygen failure, it was all closing in on him. Then, the worst sound he could imagine. The bubble gave way with a violent tremor, a shudder that reverberated through his suit. The integrity was gone. The air pressure plummeted. The oxygen content was sucked out in an instant, replaced with the dense, cold water of the alien ocean. Evan's chest constricted as he gasped for air that wasn't there. Panic surged through him as his mind struggled to process the dire situation. The crushing weight of the ocean threatened to crush his suit as the creatures circled once again, drawn to the disturbance. I'm not going to make it, am I? He whispered to himself, his breath shallow, the pressure of the water closing in on him. But just as quickly as the horror surged, a sudden burst of light pierced the deep, a blazing column of energy. The creatures recoiled, and Evan's suit reactivated with a jolt. The emergency failsafe had kicked in, and the protective shield surrounding him had reformed, just in time. He could breathe again. Evan. Get to the surface, now. Alina's voice was a lifeline, her tone urgent and relieved all at once. Evan looked up, the dark abyss still pressing in around him. He had survived, but only just. The deep was not finished with him yet, and the real test had only just begun. The ocean's oppressive silence lingered around Evan as he fought against the remaining tremors in his body. His suit hummed with the gentle, reassuring whir of its stabilization systems, but his mind was elsewhere, racing through the data that had almost cost him everything. His breath, still shallow from the shock, had slowed to a more controlled pace. Yet, the weight of the deep sea remained, a constant reminder of how close he had come to becoming just another casualty of an environment far too alien for human survival. Evan, do you copy? Alina's voice crackled through the comms, tinged with a mix of relief and raw urgency. He swallowed hard, clearing his throat. Copy. He hesitated. The words were hard to articulate, harder still to admit to himself. I almost didn't make it. That much is obvious. But you're still alive, and that's what matters right now. Get to the surface, Evan. You've proven it works. You've proven it can survive. His mind, though still disoriented from the near-death experience, latched onto those words. Survive. He had proven something, yes, but the trial was far from over. The creatures that had assaulted the bubble were still out there, lurking in the depths. And the underwater environment was just as hostile to the technology as it was to him. There was no certainty. Nothing was guaranteed, not the success of his generator, not even the promise that he would be able to reach the surface without further complications. With the emergency failsafe now fully engaged, he activated the ascent protocol. The suit's buoyancy systems adjusted, and with a sudden lurch, the ascent began. Slowly, painfully, he moved upward, leaving behind the crushing depths that had nearly taken his life. His body, still aching from the brutal forces of the dive and the near collapse of the generator, was stiff, every movement a strain. Yet, there was no time to linger. Every second counted. The deeper they went, the more the pressure lessened. The sensation of rising, of escaping, was surreal. As the ocean above him began to open up, there was a strange stillness. The creatures were no longer close, but that didn't mean they were gone. The deep still hid its secrets beneath layers of darkness and silence. And somewhere, out there, there were eyes watching, waiting for weakness. Evan, you're doing great. Just another 500 meters. We're setting up the recovery team as we speak. He gritted his teeth as he nodded, though no one could see it. Roger that. The voice in his ear was the only thing anchoring him to reality, a fragile connection to the world above. The kilometers above him seemed to stretch forever, an abyss from which he had just narrowly escaped. The suit's pressure systems began to stabilize as the surrounding water became less dense, less suffocating. It was then that he saw it, a flicker of light, an almost ghostly glow rising from below. He paused, watching it for a moment, trying to process the visual in the shadowed depths. A flash of movement, more than one. Then another. Suddenly, the creatures were back. But this time, there was no violent crash against the bubble. No gnashing of fangs. They didn't approach as predators, but as curious observers, surrounding him with their glowing tendrils in a slow, methodical dance. Their bioluminescence pulsed gently, casting an eerie blue light through the water. Evan froze, instinctively reaching for the suit's defensive systems, but he didn't fire. He waited. For what felt like an eternity, the creatures circled him, their massive forms obscured in the depths. Then, without warning, they disappeared, vanishing back into the abyss from which they had come. It was as if they had been testing him, a challenge of survival, a trial by water. He had withstood it. But at what cost? Evan, the surface is just ahead, Alina's voice broke through the tension. We've got a recovery shuttle on standby. Just a few more minutes. His pulse, still racing from the encounter, began to slow as he focused on the final stretch. The abyss had tested him, and now, the surface was within reach. But even as the sunlight began to filter down from above, he knew something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just about proving technology, it was about something far larger. The deep had a voice, and it wasn't finished with humanity yet. As he breached the surface, the sun's rays hit his visor, casting a brilliant glow across the water. For the first time in hours, he let himself breathe fully, savoring the oxygen in the air as if it were a gift. The team's recovery shuttle descended toward him, and in the distance, he could see the bright green markings of their research station. But the deep would remain out there, waiting. It always did. And humanity had just taken its first step into a domain that would never be truly conquered, only survived.